Welcome to the Spitzer School of Architecture for those of you online, and welcome to those of you in the audience. For those who don't know me, my name is Marta Gutman. I'm the Dean of the Spitzer School. And tonight I'm delighted to welcome you to the Spitzer School's Spring Lecture Series, Across the Pacific Realm, Architecture and Landscape in Translation. This lecture series is made possible by the Spitzer Architecture Fund and the generous support of Frank Sciame, who is a graduate of our school from some years ago. And it's been an honor and a privilege of mine to work with Professor Zhao in coordinating, in curating this series. So as is our wont, we'll begin by acknowledging that the Spitzer School of Architecture, grounded on the schist bedrock outcrop of Harlem, is situated upon the ancestral homeland and territory of the Munsee, Lenape, Wappinger, and Wequassajek peoples. As members of an educational community, we are obliged to know the histories of dispossession that have allowed the City College of New York to grow and thrive on a vibrant terrain. As designers and thinkers, we endeavor to build in ways that lead toward justice, and we are committed to dismantling the ongoing consequences of settler colonialism. And so tonight we are most privileged to welcome Michelle G. Magalong, Dr. Michelle G. Magalong, who is an assistant professor in the Historic Preservation Program at the University of Maryland School of Architecture in College Park. School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation in College Park, where she previously served as a presidential postdoctoral fellow. She is affiliate faculty in Asian American Studies, Urban Studies and Planning, and American Studies. It's a hefty set of titles. Dr. Magalong served as president for Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in the Historic Preservation, API, AAPI, a national nonprofit organization. She received her BA in Ethnic Studies and Urban Studies and Planning at the University of California, San Diego, and her MA and PhD in Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles, which you may know by its acronym, UCLA. This evening, we're lucky indeed that she will be presenting her talk titled, as you can see on the screen, Preserving Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Historic Sites, Dispelling and Disaggregating the Acronym and the Data. So please join me in welcoming Michelle to the Spitzer School of Architecture. And we're anticipating she'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a lively Q&A following. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, Dean Gutman, and thank you, Professor Zhang, for inviting me here to the Spitzer School of Architecture. It's a beautiful space, and so I appreciate the invitation. And I'm actually going to talk about something that's relatively new-ish for me, new in my research and in my framing, in thinking about how do we frame and preserve Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, AANHPI as the acronym, historic sites, and thinking about how do we dispel and disaggregate the acronym of AANHPI and the data. And so what I'm going to do, as Dean Gutman had read my bio, is the overview of my talk today is I spent a good amount of time in preparing for today's lecture in terms of thinking about my positionality. And that's something that I often teach in my program. I teach a studio and a graduate seminar in historic preservation with graduate students, often asking students to think about their positionality. The first day of class is an icebreaker. What is your positionality? And how does this navigate your work and the work we do as historic preservationists? And I was thinking about it today as we're in the midst of a search for a new director, looking for my new boss. And someone had mentioned, he talked about inclusion as performative versus actual. And how that becomes transparent in the work we do in terms of advocating for systems change. And so I just wanted to introduce myself as this is who I am, and this is how I navigate my work as a researcher and as a scholar. And also what I heard today, someone, the speaker had mentioned their values and said, the three things that have really encouraged my work is 1, show up, 2, listen, and 3, do no harm. And so I was thinking about it and thinking about my perspective as an Asian American. Oftentimes people ask me, where am I from? I originally, as Dean Gutman had mentioned, I was a postdoc at University of Maryland. I moved from California, where I was born and raised, to the Washington, D.C., Maryland region in 2019. That was a huge culture shift for me. I came into a place where my faculty and my students I didn't realize it until 3 years later, they didn't know I was Filipino. They thought I was Native Hawaiian. And I thought, why did you think I was Native Hawaiian? They said, well, you went to Honolulu on a trip one time, and we assumed you were going home. And I said, that's not where I'm from. And so I thought about the question of where are you from? Particularly as I was thinking of this question a few weeks ago, as I was home in San Diego. And there was a shooting in Monterey Park. And I was in the car just trying to think of the question, where are you from? And oftentimes people would ask me, like, where are you from? And I'd often say, I'm from, Washington, D.C. Now I live in Washington, D.C., but I'm originally from California, born and raised in Southern California, right? But that never seems to peak or, meet the question that they're expecting. Oftentimes, where are you from? And I think about my relationship to the Pacific as it's what that ocean grounds me. I've often gone on vacation in the Atlantic, and I think that ocean looks nothing like the Pacific, and looks very rough and cold here versus on the West Coast. It's the ocean seems very welcoming and warm. And I thought about what is my positionality in terms of where am I from? So my father, you can see in this photo, can do this correctly. This is my father, and he's somewhere here, if I can point it correctly. This is him at boot camp in San Diego, at the San Diego Naval Training Center in 1967. So I got a chance to to talk to my father during COVID. I flew to San Diego, and with the COVID restrictions, my sister said, we can only meet to eat outside. And I was staying at a hotel nearby, the former Naval Training Center. And my sister said, we'll just meet at the food court just near you. So we took my family, my father was with me, and we sat in this food court, which was now a decommissioned Naval Training Center. My dad looked at me and he said, this isn't a food court. And I said, yeah, there's a bunch of eateries and stalls. And he said, this is the Naval Mess Hall. And my father has early Alzheimer's and dementia. And he was able to recall the first time he entered into boot camp. And I turned on my camera and started recording him as he recalled his stories of, this is, we enlisted in Manila and then we got on a few planes. Him as someone who'd never been on a plane or a boat had to experience, these large carriers taking him to San Diego. So he stepped foot in boot camp, and I asked him, was this amazing to you to see this beautiful landscape? This is the United States for you, your first experience. And he said, yes, this was what brought me here. The beautiful ocean, the landscape, the weather. Often everyone says, oh, you must be so fortunate to have lived in San Diego. And so, to live in Southern California. My father still lives there in San Diego. This is him during his service on the USS Independence. And this is us. I am the middle of 3 girls. There's 4 of us. And this is us wearing our t-shirts from when my father came back from a tour of the Pacific. He was in Antarctica, Australia, and New Zealand. And so to me, the ocean has often harkened back my relationship with my family. And then this photo also, when I say, where am I from? I think about, this is at my doctoral commencement at UCLA. These are my two nieces. They're often asked, where are you from? Because they actually dance hula or Native Hawaiian dance. And they're often asked, where are you from? And so I always tell my nieces, you tell them that we are from the beaches of San Diego. We're not from the beaches of the Philippines. We are from the beaches of San Diego. And so really that has shaped how I navigate my identity as a Filipino American, as a child of immigrants. And I'm also trained as an urban planner in historic preservation, which I don't want to give that misguiding information. UCLA does not teach historic preservation. It was something that I had to teach myself. And urban planning is actually divorced from architecture. So we actually are not trained in design in any sense. So I get really mortified when someone starts to ask me architectural questions. I can't name elements. But you know, I can talk about policy and I can talk about my work in ethnic studies and how that has shaped how I navigate myself in the work. And so with my dissertation, I was very interested in how are Asian Americans represented in historic preservation as a discipline. So historic preservation as a discipline is predominantly white and it's predominantly male. As you know, we often see in historic preservation, when we think about historic preservation, it's usually the grand architectural masterpieces that you know, the US government tends to landmark and preserve. It's places like the White House, Monticello, and it's not often that we see, you know, Black, Indigenous, or people of color represented. And so, you know, particularly for me, it's about how do we define being Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. AANHPI is a relatively new term. What you'll hear more often is Asian American or Asian American Pacific Islander, AAPI. And so I wanted to frame it in the sense of this, how to be more inclusionary to understand the invisibility of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in the discussion that we have in terms of Asian American studies. And so one of the difficult parts of defining ourselves as AANHPI is it's a mouthful. As you can see on this, oops, I just gave away everything. As you can see in this chart, oftentimes what we think of as Asian American, we often think of East Asian as Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, or Filipinos, and also South Asian. But what we have to unpack a bit more is the term and the ethnic terms. And here you see this this graphic that was produced by the Bureau of the US Census, where they started to break it down a bit more. As you can see here, there is more Southeast Asian and South Asian representation. But there's also the question of, but who is missing here, right? And who's missing here is there are no Pacific Islanders and there are no Native Hawaiians that are counted in the US Census. And so if the US Census counts that way, then how does the Department of Interior, which houses the National Park Service, count us? And so, and how do we dispel the acronym? And how do we center ourselves thinking about Asia and the Pacific? That's Japan, I went too far. But the Pacific in that way. And as you see here in this chart, starting to think about what does our income look like? And I included this graphic in terms of thinking about income, as oftentimes our identity as Asian Americans is we're often seen as one, that we are seen as model minority, that we're doing well. You know, we're you know, going into the Ivy League schools, you know, our representation is very much intact. But you know, what's interesting is people don't think about our median household income. For, if I can find the right one, for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, they tend to be lower on the spectrum in terms of median household income. And also so you see here, Tongans are on the lower third in terms of household income. And also other Pacific Islander. And so how do we start to disaggregate that data so we can understand what are their needs? And, you know, to think about where are they? You know, where are they located? during the height of COVID, it was a moment where so many of us, it shut down, right? It was a moment where we had to think about what's going to happen next. And it was an interesting moment as I turned to my colleagues in the work I do as a volunteer president of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, AAPI as a shorter acronym. As the thing that I was fearful of is that I knew about the hysteria that ensued in 1919 with the Spanish flu, right? I knew about what had happened in Angel Island, the West Coast. It's not the West Coast equivalent to the Statue of Liberty or Ellis Island, but it was a detention station for immigrants who were coming across the Pacific. And then in this middle image here, you can see there was examinations of Asian bodies in a sense. And it was this moment in Angel Island in San Francisco, where it was basically they examined the bodies to see if you were a foreign threat, right? If your physicality and your health were a threat to the United States. And so, the sense of we were perpetual foreigners and that we are these model minorities are stereotypes that we need to dispel. And oftentimes when people think, where are you from? Often assumes that you just arrived, that you're just fresh off the boat, that Asian Americans, have a short relationship in terms of history. But I wanted to also note, this is Queen Liliuokalani. She was the last queen of the sovereign state of Hawaii. And the sense of for Native Hawaiians to ask that question of where are you from is oftentimes in the same kind of light of asking a Native American, where are you from? It's there, it's a sense of the United States didn't just land here, they landed on this land and stole the sovereign rights of Native Hawaiians. And then I also include, thinking about us as perpetual foreigners, as exclusionary acts. This flyer associated with the 1882 Exclusion Act, where Chinese bodies were marked as threats to the United States, and acts of violence were encouraged against Chinese immigrants and migrants at that time. And it was this moment for me and my board of directors to think about how do we frame this time of COVID for folks to know that there's how do you combat anti-Asian hate and violence. And so we actually hosted this Zoom event. It was an interesting time where we were all teaching each other Zoom. And we hosted this event with scholars who have been doing research on exclusionary acts in public health in the built environment, including Dr. Hayashi, who has looked at the Japanese hospital in Los Angeles, Dr. Hallman, Dr. Shah, who have looked at Chinatown and San Francisco's Chinese American community, and at Mr. Tepborn, who was the executive director of Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. These individuals looking at how they've used historic preservation as a platform of education to think about anti-Asian hate and violence, not only of the bodies of the people, but situated in place. And so in thinking about how do you unpack the acronym of Asian American AANHPI, I started thinking about Professor George Lipsitz, who I was fortunate to be mentored by at UC San Diego, as in his pivotal book, How Racism Takes Place. How do we think about spatializing race, Asian Americans and ethnic enclaves? Oftentimes we think of Chinatowns, these grand gateways, and this, what is the design of Asian American ethnic enclaves? When I was a master's student at UCLA, I worked on my master's thesis here this is the then city council member of our district, Eric Garcetti. He just left his office as mayor of Los Angeles. He was a junior council member, and we had worked on the designation of historic Filipino town, the longest sign in the city of LA. But what's interesting is historic Filipino town has started to, it was a place that they fought for recognition. They fought for recognition. Oftentimes they were saying, well, you don't look like a Chinatown. You don't have, special characters, right? A lot of our language, we come from a history of colonization from Spain and the United States. And so everything for us, it's very much Americanized or has Spanish influence in our language and dialects. And also our vernacular looks very American in that sense. So if you ever drive through historic Filipino town, which is near Chavez Ravine, I know, home of the Dodgers. But also if you drive through there, you wouldn't know you're in historic Filipino town. So it was this fight for us to think about how do we preserve our identity in place and how do we make sure that no one forgets who we are. This was designated in 2002. What was interesting is what has developed since then in the last 20 years. We were just trying to stay relevant. It was a moment where gentrification wasn't something we had, a term that wasn't a threat at that point. But the town, the neighborhood has gone through waves of gentrification and displacement and also a renaming. Because historic Filipino town is too long. And as New Yorkers know, when it's too long, you just take the first few letters of each name. So now it's known as Hi-Fi, right? Which, I don't know if people know, it's a generational thing. Hi-Fi is often associated with records, with vinyl records. And so it's very interesting. I was like, well, if you don't know the significance of Hi-Fi, then how will you be able to ask those questions of what makes this place historic and what makes it a Filipino town? But rather now it's become very hip. Everyone wants to go to Hi-Fi. Filipino food has become very hip and trendy. And so it's become a destination place. But with that, it's been going through a lot of issues of displacement and redevelopment to the point now where, the residents are being pushed out. Historic structures are being demolished. And now the sense of identity, the sense of belonging isn't really transparent as it was very difficult already, but people are being pushed out and now it's seen as a hip trendy place. But I also started to think as a scholar, like, how do we unpack identity? How do we think about issues of gender, class, and placemaking, particularly for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders? As I had mentioned, Queen Liliuokalani, this is Iolani Palace in Honolulu, nearby the airport, the Honolulu airport. So this is the last palace. It's actually the only palace in the United States associated with a monarchy. And it's actually a place that they've done a lot of work in terms of how do you educate the public visitor to think about Native Hawaiians. They've actually been a very interesting site to work with. The curators and educators there are grappling with issues of climate change. And I said, what do you mean? You're not in threat of floods. And they said, well, as a visitor center, we have to meet the needs of our visitors, which includes the need for Wi-Fi and the need for air conditioning. And, back in its heyday with the Queen, there was able to have ocean breeze from the front of the palace to the back. But because of the loss of the ocean breeze, and then they now have to install air conditioning units and Wi-Fi, and she's like, it's been horrible for us because our door frames have been, like, how do you adjust a national historic landmark through these changes of climate change? And then she goes, I don't even want to talk about the need for technology, well, there is a need for technology, but how the demand for Wi-Fi has really threatened the integrity of buildings like this. And then here are activists near a Pagat village in Guam, as I mentioned with API HIP. API HIP started as an organization that just wanted to get people together to say we exist. It's not a predominant, to kind of fight against the whiteness that is in the discipline of historic preservation. And the issue of Pagat Guam came to our attention. The Department of Defense, the US military, was looking at de-designating Pagat village as an ancestral site into a military firing range. And so us as an organization caught the attention of then President Obama of what was threatened. And so we were able to save Pagat village with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And thinking about what are sacred sites in the cultural landscape. And I'll show you later on in the slides what that looks like. Pagat, you would think, oh, it's just by the ocean. It has no meaning, right? But for many folks, for many Pacific Islanders, places of natural landscapes hold significance to them of an ancestral connection. And so that is something that we've been, reframing the discussion of like, what do natural landscapes, what does landscape architecture look like for us, and how do we preserve that with through the interpretation of the people and their, the ancestors and their connection to the descendants. Another place of interest that we've looked at is the Hawaiian Mission Houses, Historic Site and Archives, which is an NHL from 1965. So I had mentioned that I went on a trip in Honolulu in 2020, API HIP. We had our national convening there right before COVID. And one of the questions that we were grappled with, as many conference organizers think about, is how do we highlight the places that matter? And so for us, it was thinking like, we're not going to list places to visit like the beaches or Waikiki. Rather, we wanted to show places that are often seen as or rendered invisible. And what's interesting about the Hawaiian Mission Houses, if you're ever in downtown, you would never notice this. It's on a busy, this is King Street, which is the main street. I want to say Costco is just around here. Costco and the airport are nearby. But you would never notice you wouldn't notice because of the green landscape that there are these historic structures here, right? And I knew that was there. Even as I was driving, I was like, oh wait, what's that? Like I had forgotten about, our focus of these mission houses and the wonderful work that community organizers are pulling together to say, as you can imagine, they had fought against the demolition of this site, the redevelopment of the downtown area and its significance. And, what was interesting though, for Native Hawaiians, as they tried to preserve this site, its mission house is associated with early American presence. As you can see in the description, these are Western style houses. There's an 1821 mission house, 1831 Chamberlain house, an 1841 bedroom annex, cemetery, collection storage vault, gift shop, and multi-purpose space. And so what's interesting, as much as we try to decolonize preservation, we're still colonizing in our efforts, right? We're perpetuating the colonization and thinking about who are the early settlers. As Dean Gutman had talked about, how do we frame our position as settlers in this colonial environment, right? And who owned these buildings, right? Who introduced, the architectural design of homes that look like these mission houses? And what is the role in terms of us preserving the settler history in Hawaii? And so in terms of finding AA and API places, I want to mention, if you go on API HIP's website, and I'll share that at the end, we have a crowdsourced web page with history pin, where we allow folks to pin places of significance, if it's architectural materials, audio, oral histories, or any kind of video that we can locate. And we tend to do it like here. I had my intern pin NHLs, National Historic Landmarks. And so she had contributed, I think it says 118 pins. And as you can see here, we've been able to pin in the last decade, 623 on the West Coast, 167. I think it's pretty representative of representation of the population. 75 in Hawaii, and this is 25 in other parts of the Pacific. Where are we And so this was something that my organization, we had posed to the public, is where are we? Are there places that are not landmarked, but are significant? If they're not landmarked, are they threatened or are they forgotten? And so this has been something of a major piece of work for us of thinking about how do we acknowledge landmark designations and how do we also acknowledge the invisibility of places. And also, as I was writing my dissertation, I fell upon this work by the late Dr. Franklin Odo. Dr. Odo passed away last September. He was a pioneer in Asian American studies, and he had worked on the National Park Service National Historic Landmarks AAPI theme study. And I want to mention this was the quote very long. I apologize. But this is actually from my dissertation. I was able to capture an oral history from Dr. Odo. And what was very striking for me was how Dr. Odo, oops, I know you're probably in the midst of reading that. But Dr. Odo had noted, so he was a third generation Japanese American, actually named after Franklin Roosevelt. His mother had named him after FDR. He was born before World War II. And he had talked about how he came into his role as part of the NHL committee. NHLs, whoever sits on the advisory committee, these are like the top experts in the country. And so Dr. Odo was the Asian American representative on the NHL committee. And he was wondering, of all these NHLs, which are really hard to get designated, how many are associated with Asian Americans? And so that's where he said there's 33 in his home state of Hawaii. And so he was looking at what does that consist of? And so I remember him talking about how half of the NHL designations were Native Hawaiian heiaus or sacred sites that were considered prehistoric. And then the other half had to do with Pearl Harbor. So Navy bases, points of battle and combat. And he's like, that's very weird. It went from prehistoric to the fight for World War II, right? He goes, where else are we? How do you tell our story in preservation if, you know, if the discipline, if the federal government is failing to do so? And so Dr. Odo wrote, if you go, I can share the link later. If you search NPS NHL AAPI theme study, you'll see his book. It's this pink cover. There's 12 chapters in there, and how Dr. Odo had the responsibility of framing the Asian American history story. And we were really fortunate to have Dr. Odo, someone who was very much aware of the issues in framing Asian American studies and thinking about how do we need to be more inclusive and understand our role as settlers in Hawaii and in the United States. And so Dr. Odo, in his, I think there's 14 essays, he included 3 essays and 4 scholars of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander studies to really frame from their perspective, what does it look like to do preservation of their cultural landscapes? And the essays are all available online. And so we were really fortunate to have someone like Dr. Amy Stillman over at University of Michigan to talk about what does it look like to frame America during the earliest prehistoric times of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, and understand the mobility and what is the history of diaspora for Pacific Islanders in the United States. And then you see here, essay number 12, Dr. Marsh and Dr. Naputi talked about the invisibility again of Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians. And so the intention for the AAPI theme study is that it's supposed to provide guidance to National Park Service staff in doing better work and doing better research on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And for me, what is disaggregating? our acronym mean and why is it important? The data at the National Park Service makes visible the needs of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islander communities and helps to ensure that they receive their fair share of resources and support. And again, what does fair share of resources and support look like? It's to achieve racial equity within and for AA and HPI communities, for which policymakers should see and understand the diversity within AA and HPI subgroups. And I had mentioned Dr. Odo has done extensive scholarship on Native Hawaiian landscape. And how do we, this was supposed to say, recenter the Pacific in preservation, and thinking about places like Guam as US territories, America Samoa, the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, CNMI, and Tonga. What's been interesting in the work that I've been doing in terms of what does it mean to support NHPIs? We have federal policies like the Native American Graves Protection and Recreation Act, which oftentimes Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are not invited to the decision-making table in thinking about things like NAGPRA, right? And I actually had a student in my graduate seminar ask me last week, why aren't Native Hawaiians invited to NAGPRA, right? And I said, well, that's an assumption that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders don't know about NAGPRA, but actually they qualify. But what's interesting is Native Americans and Native Hawaiians, the way that their land has been taken, there was no treaty to, so Native Hawaiians do not have a federally recognized, reservation on the state of Hawaii, but rather what were the agreements upon what they were eligible for. And so there have been failures with NAGPRA and the National Park Service in terms of allowing funding to be prioritized for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Another example I have is the failure of the Historic Preservation Fund, which is the major fund in the federal government in funding historic preservation programs. Oftentimes, since I'm located in DC, I've gone to advocacy weeks through Preservation Action, our advocacy organization. And every time I go, there's never a mention of Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders. It's been a very frustrating conversation where they'll have write-ups on what needs to be funded. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are not ever in the discussion. When the National Trust for Historic Preservation actually did a call of supporting BIPOC historic preservation efforts, they failed to include Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And so when I was on that call, I said to the president, I said, why aren't Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders included? And he said, oh, well, we all assume everyone knows. It's in the acronym when you say AAPI. And I said, no, but that is when Native Hawaiians don't see their name on the list of eligible communities. To them, that's a signal of that they're rendered invisible. And so what was really saddening was the president said, you guys are included. And I said, well, one, that was presumptuous because you said you guys, you think that I'm Native Hawaiian. And two, it's presumptuous that you think like Native Hawaiians automatically assume that they're included in the conversation. And so what was interesting for the National Trust for Historic Preservation is they've changed their language now. Now they actually hold listening sessions with Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And I have fought for us to be separated out because they were like, we should have a listening session with AAPIs. And I said, okay, you should have one session for Asian Americans and another session for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And I've had staff say to me, that's double work. And I said, very much needed double work because we need to understand our role as Asian Americans in being complacent and perpetuating our settler identity within that context of as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And so, and as I had mentioned, this was at the forum we had in 2020 in Honolulu, We're actually at the East-West Center, which is an IMPA design campus. It is not on the National Register of Historic Places. It's actually eligible. But I bring that up that this is an IMPA building. This was the first conference center to be named after the murder of JFK. And so, I mean, in terms of significance and integrity, they check all the boxes. But I remember asking our state historic preservation officer, why is this not on the National Register? This is a super easy, designation to get on the register. And then the SHPO said, oh, I don't know, it's not a priority for us. And I said, well, IMPA just died, right? Like usually in preservation, you can't name someone after, or you can't get it designated until they die, right? And I often say, Dolores Huerta, who's associated with Cesar Chavez and the farm labor movement, she can't get anything designated because she's still alive. Which I was like, that's ironic. You have to wait for the person to die and then deemed it significant. So IMPA is not on the National Register, which I find very ironic, or the East-West Center here. And I ended up finding out from the local community members and preservationists, and they said, the East-West Center doesn't want this to be on the National Register because that means that would restrict their ability to restore or do any work on the exterior, right? Which, oftentimes is very frustrating in terms of what are the priorities of preservationists versus, their responsibilities of representing, the people, like IMPA. And so, how does it prioritize whiteness and settler landscapes, like in the Chinatown and mid-century modern architecture in Hawaii? And I started to kind of feel frustrated in Hawaii as many of the preservation entities there really prioritize whiteness through home ownership. What was told to me is on the National Register, if you're familiar, and I wish I could bring up the state map of Hawaii. If you're familiar with Waikiki and Diamond Head, where it's like the beautiful mansions are, if you look at the National Register, all of them are listed between Waikiki and Diamond Head. Everything else is deemed as not eligible. And I thought, well, is that associated with the white homeowners in Hawaii? And they said, yes. White homeowners are willing to preserve their homes versus, Native Hawaiians, they're in a struggle of like, what is our sovereign right to the land, right? Like, were they given ability to own their homes? And were Asian Americans as migrant laborers in Oahu, were they able to afford home ownership? And so, how do you prioritize whiteness through home ownership in Hawaii is very evident in the state register. And so, as I mentioned here, really, how do we start to unpack the National Park Service, the AAPI theme study, as Dr. Franklin's Odo's legacy in terms of how do you look at ethnicity in public history and preservation work? We start to do that here in the state of California, or not here in the state of California, but over there in the state of California, they just completed their first Asian American and Pacific Islander historic context statement in 2019 and fought for the inclusion of Native Hawaiians and Guamanian, Chamorros, and Samoan Tongans in California. So it's the first one in the nation in terms of the SHPO's placing a priority. Hawaii has not done similar work. They're a little bit behind. California has created a framework of how do you be more inclusive and how do you unpack our settler legacy in the preservation work that we do. And so to kind of just wrap up and thinking about what does community engagement and empowerment look like in AA and HPI communities, as I had mentioned, some of the core values of the work I do is that we show up, we listen, and do no harm. And really, one of the struggles that I've had in this presentation is how do I present this work as a settler? right? I am not Native Hawaiian, I'm not Pacific Islander, but how do I be an ally and an advocate for folks who may not be invited to the table? And so, the last thing I want to mention is there's a National Park Service Special Resource Study for the island of Rota, which is just part of the Northern Mariana Islands CNMI of the Commonwealth. And it was completed during the time of COVID. It was requested by their member of Congress, Representative Greg Sablan. And so the National Park Service conducted the study in 2017. They had a newsletter, project website, and they had meetings with community members, agencies, elected officials, and the public at large. So they received the public comments and informed the development of the study. But so the National Park Service just released this, and there are three options: were to do nothing, to continue in the current management of the island of Rota; two, to consider National Historic Park conceptualization for the island of Rota; and third, to pursue national monument or preserve as a concept for the island of Rota. And this is something for me as a scholar at the University of Maryland. I am actually in the formation of creating a field school for my graduate students to go to Rota and Guam during summer or during the winter break, to actually go and look at what are our roles. As I ask my students, how can we as outsiders, preservationists, and settlers engage in local preservation efforts? And how can we elevate local work to consider options 1 or 2 in meaningful and sustainable ways? And what are the impacts and dangers of supporting options 1, 2, or 3 as we start to explore our role as Asian Americans in advocating for more inclusive actions for supporting Native Americans, or Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And so I want to thank you for your time tonight. This is just my email. This is the organization and our website. If you're interested in learning a bit more about us, and I want to open up for more conversation. So thank you. I'm going to turn on the light.
It's the top one.
It's the top one. I don't want to shock all of you.
It's okay.
Maybe shocked.
There.
So are there questions for Michelle?
So if to decolonize Hawaii, does the United States have to withdraw its entire presence from Hawaii? And if it does do that, how is that done in a way that doesn't completely destabilize the country? And how do we make sure that the new government actually has, people that are in that government are actually Native Hawaiian and they have a significant stakeholder? Is that even possible at this point? Has the United States ravaged these islands too much at this point for that to be a reasonable outcome where people will survive and live with dignity?
And so I'll kind of capture your question for folks who are on Zoom. The question was asking about how do we decolonize and think about if the United States were to return the state of Hawaii to Native Hawaiians in their fight for sovereignty. And as much as I would like to answer that question, I also feel a little bit uncomfortable as I'm not a Native Hawaiian scholar, but based on my observations in the last 20-25 years with Native Hawaiian scholars, that is something that's been actually very complicated in a sense of how do you return back to the land? How do you give back its sovereignty? And how do you unpack things like land deeds and titles? Like who owns what? What does reparations look like for the state of Hawaii? And that is a very tough question, as there have been many in the Native Hawaiian sovereignty movement who have tried to think about what are the different, looking at scale, like what does it mean to return it back to the government? What would our government look like? And I think it's something that's been an interesting question in terms of the United States stronghold. In terms of the built environment, so much of its imprint is there. Maybe the military bases and the homes and then, the infrastructure that is set there. How do we kind of bring it back to their original inhabitants? It's a very complicated question. Native Hawaiian scholars, I had one scholar, Dr. Daviana McGregor, she sat with me for the National Park Service theme study, and I asked her the question of like, do you actually support historic preservation? In that you understand that it promotes whiteness, it promotes and it preserves whiteness. And she said, it's something that I grapple with every day. And I asked her, I said, why? And she said, well, my family ancestral land, I wrote the National Register nomination. She's like, I had to reconcile the conflict that I have as a Native Hawaiian in seeking designation. It's like, how do you start to unpack that, how do you start to unpack the trauma that is so deeply embedded in the environment in Hawaii? So I think that's a tough question that I think both the United States in terms of the legality of it and Native Hawaiian activists are fighting for. I think that's something that's very similar to the fight for Mauna Kea in the Big Island, where folks are, basically saying, this is our place, don't build on it. And so I think it's brought up a resurgence of the need to discuss who owns what and what is significant to them, right? It's been a lot of issues of learning and investment of what does Mauna Kea mean and for whom. Like, who owns this land and who has the right to claim it is a very important question. And that was something that we grappled with when we did our conference in Honolulu. One of my philosophies that we have our convening every 2 years in a different place. And I say it's like the Olympics, but not in the Olympics in the way like where we just build and then we have our performance and then we leave, right? But rather, how do we come to a place, understand the community, build trust, engage in them, listen to what's going on? And that was a question that we had to grapple with of how do we talk about Mauna Kea? We are preservationists by training, that we are, we perpetuate whiteness, right? We perpetuate this sense of legitimacy in the built environment. And it was something that we grappled with. We brought in actual Native Hawaiian legal scholars to talk about how do we support sovereignty and rights for Native Hawaiians given the threat of Mauna Kea. And so, and that is something, like the way our value system works is we do it in terms of elevating the voices of folks who are often marginalized, right? And invite them to the conversation. And every time, if I'm asked to speak at an event, I'll often say, I wish I didn't say to you, Dean Gutman, I often say, no, can you invite, this scholar? So how do you invite them to represent themselves and not have other people represent them is often a very difficult thing of like, how do you fight for their sovereignty? And I know it's very difficult. I heard actually that the Magnum PI house in Oahu is on the National Register. And I know I'm being recorded, so I can't say, but I've heard the Magnum PI house is owned by President Obama. And I thought, that's very complicated, right? He lives in a place that's federally recognized as a historic place, but it's also on Native Hawaiian land. So how do you untangle that complexity of President Obama's legacy as a homeowner and as a former president in that land? And so, when you ask the question of like, how do you give back that land? I was like, would President Obama give back that house? What does that mean for the homeowners to return the deed back? What does reparations look like? And I know, in terms of talking about reparations and African Americans, as the enslaved. And I think there's similarity, right? There's similar alignment of thinking of as we pose that question for African Americans is what does reparations look like? And coming from Los Angeles, actually, there's a place called Bruce's Beach, which was owned by an African American family. The Bruce family actually, it was sold to the County Board of Supervisors of Los Angeles. The County Board of Supervisors basically took the land. They used eminent domain in their favor. In the last few years, preservationists have been unearthing Bruce's Beach as the Black Beach. It was a place that was segregated. And so the County of Los Angeles Board of Supervisors actually returned the Bruce's Beach back to the family, which is over millions of dollars in value now. And so, that's often a case of what does reparations look like? And I often say reparations and the return to sovereignty for Native Hawaiians looks like Bruce's Beach. It's still early on in terms of like, how does that look like in the built environment? But in the court system, I think Bruce's Beach is allowing us to see what does reparations look like. But thank you for that question. Any other questions?
Just to say that there's another bit of story on the Bruce's Beach situation, which is that the Bruce brothers, the four men who received the payment from the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. They sold the land back. They just recently decided to sell back because the property was designated in such a way that it could never be used for anything but a public park.
Yeah.
So they decided to turn the land back and then gain some of the compensation that had been denied them for generations, given the theft of property that had happened originally. It's very controversial, but I can understand the decision. It's a very, these are tough positions to be in.
It's very complicated. The California the coastline in California is very well protected by the state and the federal government, to the point where there's a designation on the National Register. I can't remember the name, but there's in Orange County along Laguna Beach, there's these cottages that just got on the National Register. It took over 30 years to get designation because the state of California wanted to reserve the rights. Who has access to the land? And I think Bruce's Beach has brought up that question of like, what is the legality of land and ownership in the United States? Who has access to it? And Bruce's Beach has really shown how complicated it is. Of like, if reparations looks like the return of land to the rightful owners, how hard is it to really give it back? And I know it's even a discussion for the Bruce family of like, so technically, do we give it back to the Tongan people, the Native American people of the land? And how does that look like for the Tongan people who it's not a federally recognized tribe? Right, it's not a federally recognized reservation, and the Tongan people, I don't want to say they don't exist, but they don't have a formalized entity. So it's not like the Bruce family can say, well, then we return it back to Native Americans, right? Because there's been such destruction of the land that, it's so complicated. And then there's in the state of California, it's called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. That is something that preservationists, we love to hold that tool in our toolbox. Because every time something is up for designation or demolition, we often say, does it meet CEQA? And oftentimes for many marginalized communities, cities often say, no, we did not complete CEQA because it's very expensive to pay for that kind of assessment to be done. And so, it's often a question of who has access and who has the skills and knowledge set to complete all of this work. And so it's for environmental lawyers, this is why they get paid very well. It's super complicated.
Are there other comments or questions?
Thanks for sharing what is very informative. Professor Odo looked at communities that the history is not totally covered. So there are a lot of narratives that are silenced. Is there any use of archaeology in informing what might not be covered in Western narratives?
Yes, in terms of archaeology, as I mentioned, for the Islander Rota, the National Park Service has set aside funding to do archaeological work of the sacred sites. They say they want to create a preserve concept. The preserve is actually, there's limestone that they need to unearth and dig through. So there's been archaeological priorities for Pacific Islanders. And I've seen it also, archaeology work done local to me in Maryland with my colleagues. My colleagues have done archaeological work at enslaved sites, right? Of what does this mean and how do we reinterpret it, you know? I'm trying to remember the news piece that came out last week, but I think they found a piece associated with Harriet Tubman's birthplace. And from what I heard, the archaeologists sat on it for a while. They didn't tell anyone, you know? And so what is the right of archaeologists in unearthing this narrative of Harriet Tubman as a site of enslavement, particularly as it's part of a National Park Service area? And so how do you tell that story? What is your responsibility in unearthing that story and reporting it out? I think it's been a key issue. I've had colleagues who've been very dedicated to archaeology work and preservation. And it's been amazing to see how that archaeology work has been presented both at like places like the Harriet Tubman Visitor Center, National Historic Park, and at the National Museum of African American Heritage, History and Culture in Namak at the Smithsonian. I actually took my students to Namak on Sunday, and they got all lit up because there was a room that was a family genealogy room. And in the genealogy room, they had archival materials there showing like, this is what archaeology looks like. And I had a student say, oh, so my work is valid, right? And I was like, yeah, your work is valid. I mean, you know, archaeologists are seen as important. But he turned to me as a white male student, and he's like, I'm still trying to figure out my positionality as a white male. And how do I do this work as an archaeologist? And so to me, I took that as something like to take seriously, to listen to students as they grapple with their positionality and in the work they do in the disciplines that they choose. So there was one other hand I saw.
I have a question. So you mentioned SHPO in your talk, and I'm an architect and recently been working on a project that might be under that scrutiny. And how does, so I'm trying to understand, you do want designation from SHPO in order for the kind of validation of some of these projects that you're working on. However, SHPO's lens of preservation is so limited in a way, and yeah, how do you reconcile that? You know, they're always looking for this authentic moment, and it's very frustrating for a lot of people who are working on projects such as these. So how do you see that as a kind of advantage, disadvantage to your work?
I've always been conflicted by SHPOs. They are either your best friend or your worst enemy.
Just to say that the SHPO stands for State Office of Historic Preservation.
Yes, and it's an appointed person by the governor for each state. There's an equivalent for Native American sites, it's THPOs, Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. But historic preservation officers, the way it works is if, like, let's say this building, you wanted it to be on the National Register. You would write the nomination form, send it to your SHPO. Your SHPO either approves or rejects it. And then if he or she approves it, then it gets picked up to the National Register, which is overseen by the National Park Service. And so SHPOs act as gatekeepers. And so, and I often say that I have a love-hate relationship with many of them. In a sense of when I mentioned the historic Filipino town. So we were working on a designation for under Preserve America, which is a federal recognition under the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. We had submitted it to be considered under a 5 historic ethnic neighborhood kind of portfolio with Chinatown, Little Tokyo, Thai Town, Koreatown, and historic Filipino town. Of the 5 towns in the city of LA, the historic Filipino town and Thai town were rejected. The other 3 were approved and received money right away. And so, but I came in later on and resubmitted the proposal for historic Filipino town. To which then the staff were like, it's not significant, there's no architecture, you can't tell it's the Philippines. And I was like, what? I don't know what you want to see. You know, do you want to see like chickens running around? I don't know what your stereotype of Filipinos are, right? Like, what is the visual you expect to see? But we were very fortunate at ACHP. The chair at the time was the former SHPO of California. And he called me and he was like, the staff, you know, they don't understand what a Filipino looks like what does Filipino architecture looks like. And he said, I'm going to refute their claim to reject your application and approve it, knowing that you have shown through my archaeology work and archival research that historically there was a presence of Filipinos in historic Filipino town. And so that's why I say there's a love-hate, because that person, a former SHPO, he said, as a SHPO, I've seen so many things go up to the state of California, get denied. And then those nominations never get pursued ever again. They get no feedback. They get, you know, I'm like, they're like the worst professors. They give you no feedback. They just fail you and don't tell you anything. And you just assume that it's not significant, right? And so rather than being a helpful professor and tell you how to do better for the next round of resubmission. And so SHPOs tend to do that. They're the gatekeepers, you know, and it's often, you know, under their own lens. What are you looking for? And so, and I mentioned the Hawaii SHPO is an interesting SHPO in the sense of I'm always curious as to what kind of nominations or landmarks get through to the National Register. So the National Park Service, the keeper of the National Register, she has a bulletin every 6 months, and they announce what gets included into the National Register. And I'm always like, how are they gonna do? You know, like what states actually advocated on behalf of BIPOC communities. And it's a very interesting thing. It's the usual suspects. It's the blue states, you know, do a really good job, and then the red states, you see no action happening. So it's a very interesting thing of just like SHPOs, you know, when I meet them, I'm kind of cringing, you know, like, you know your role, but you know your role to the point that you do nothing, right? They maintain the status quo of what's the practice, you know. But what's amazing is in the work I was doing in my dissertation work is I actually interviewed the keeper of the National Register and found that she was an agent of change. She was someone who was just like, I want to advocate for more BIPOC nominations. And so she started to change policy. She started to provide testimony to the president to say, this is the way, these are the funding streams we can use to hopefully help support more nominations from BIPOC communities to come through. To me, I was in her role, she was like, it's my job to tell SHPOs to do a better job. And to me, I was really inspired by that I was like, she as a white woman knew her role as an ally and how to, you know, how to improve the discipline and become more relevant to a field that was really dying at the moment, right? Historic preservation was seen as, oh, they just maintain whiteness and home ownership in that sense, and you know, the masterpieces in architecture. But how can we look more at the vernacular to be seen as significant as the masterpieces of like Monticello and that's the same. hopefully that helped answer your question.
I think we may be ready to say thank you. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.